ICPC make them better. Let's make Nigeria great again. ICPC they watch you. For corruption.
Hello viewers, welcome to another yet exciting edition of Corruption Must Go, ICPC's weekly television program. I am your host, Hawa Garba. Corruption constitutes one of the biggest challenges to good governance, but it is often widely and erroneously perceived as only a public sector problem. Most conversations on corruption center on the public sector context, and oftentimes anti-corruption measures and strategies are designed towards mitigating public sector corruption. However, it is evident that private sector actors are essential participants in the activities of the public sector. They can therefore be either victims of corruption or collaborators in perpetrating the acts. Today on the program, we shall take a look at how corruption can be diminished in the private sector as we speak to some experts. We will also take a look at sections of the ICPC Act 2000 which prohibits such acts and if the Commission has dealt with any such cases in the past. We will bring you details of this and more after our segment on anti-corruption stories with Joy Aja. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you, Hawa. Welcome to this segment on anti-corruption stories. I am Joy Aja. A federal high court sitting in Kaduna, presided over by Honorable Justice P.H. Malong, has sentenced a former registrar of the court, Mr. Joseph Etefia Udo, to 4 years imprisonment for laundering the sum of 80 million naira. Mr. Udo and his wife, Grace Udo, were in December 2019 arraigned by ICPC on a 12-count charge for alleged misappropriation of 80 million naira that had been deposited in the court by a litigant. The convict reportedly issued checks in the name of his wife, who is also a staff of the Federal High Court of Justice in Abuja, and used the money to acquire properties in some major cities across Nigeria. Based on a plea bargain agreement entered with the convict, the charges labeled against him were amended to 4 counts, and those against his wife dropped. When the charges were read before the convict, he pleaded guilty to all of them. The presiding judge, Justice Malong, while delivering judgment, convicted Mr. Udo to 12 months imprisonment on each count, which are to run concurrently. The court also ruled that all properties seized by ICPC in the course of investigation as listed in the schedule of the plea bargain agreement be forfeited to the Commission and be sold with the proceeds given to the victims of the crime. In addition, a lien would be placed on the convict's retirement benefits and pension savings for any balance still outstanding against the defendant after the sale of the forfeited properties. And in the event of any outstanding sum and balance payment by the convict remain unpaid, same is to be paid by installments as agreed by the complainant and the convict in accordance with Section 429 of the Administration of Criminal Justice Act 2015. In a related development, a deputy director in the Sokoto State Civil Service, Mr. Aminu Abdullahi Mega, has been sentenced to 10 years imprisonment by the Sokoto State High Court for defrauding the state government of 2.6 million naira. Mega, a deputy director infrastructure of the Sokoto Agriculture Development Project, SADP, was earlier arraigned by ICPC on a 2-count charge bordering on fraudulent diversion of government funds. ICPC, in a charge sheet filed before Justice Malami Umar of High Court 3, Sokoto, accused Mr. Mega of fraudulently converting into personal use the sum of 2.6 million naira, being government money, meant for the construction of borehole at SADP housing estates in the state. He was also accused of presenting fake receipts to the Commission during investigation to cover the fraud thereby committing an offense contrary to sections 16 and 19 of the Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Act 2000. He pleaded guilty when the charge was read to him. ICPC counsel Mashkol Salisu, who had earlier tendered before the court documents showing evidence of recoveries made from the convict by the commission, prayed the judge to sentence him as charged according to the provisions of Section 273, subsection 2 of the Administration of Criminal Justice Law 2019 of Sokoto State. Justice Umar, after the plea, sentenced the convict to 10 years imprisonment, 5 years on each count, which would be served concurrently. The ruling also includes an option of fine of 90,000 naira on each of the counts. That will be all on this segment. Corruption Must Go continues with Hawa. Stay with us.
If you are joining us, this is Corruption Must Go. The private sector has a role to play in designing a sector-specific collective action program that would help in the reduction of corruption. But first, let us find out what private sector corruption is and what it entails. Mrs. Lola Adekonye of Center for International Private Enterprise throws more light on this. Stay with us.
So private sector corruption, there are two things I would like to differentiate. A lot of us in the anti-corruption community understand private sector corruption to mean commercial bribery or corruption involving two private sector entities. So a business and another business involved in some kind of collusion, maybe to fix prices, distort the market, or a smaller business bribing the procurement officers, in another business, in a larger business. So that's corruption not involving the public sector. Private sector to private sector. But there is also the role of the private sector in enabling corruption. That's another angle to this. If you think about it like a market, think about corruption like a market. There's a giver, there's a taker. There are two people involved. It's either someone is paying it, right? Or someone is colluding, or someone is coercing somebody else to do something wrong, right? So if you think about it in that context, in a very typical sense, a company bribing a public officer, that's corruption. Before I come to what the private sector can do, let me quickly talk about what the public sector can do to help the private sector fight corruption.
Yes.
The public sector, especially anti-corruption agencies like the ICPC, for instance, can give more guidance to the private sector about how to comply with the ICPC Act, for instance, right? I'll give you a quick example. The US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which you might be very familiar with, that prohibits corruption by US companies anywhere in the world. It was passed in 1977, but nobody heard about it until around 2001, 2004, when the US Department of Justice, which is, like the Ministry of Justice, but they're essentially the anti-corruption agency in the US, started to give more guidance to companies about how to comply with that act to prevent corruption in their operations. And so now, the convergence around the Western countries, Europe and America, is that companies should have basic things like a compliance program. They should have policies and procedures. They should have monitoring and improvement. They should do a risk assessment of corruption in their operations. Basic things like that. So the more guidance ICPC can give the business community. Shout out to the Institute of Directors of Nigeria. They just published their ethics code, which is essentially the anti-corruption code for their members. So the first things first, set standards. Set standards for businesses to say, just like you have corporate governance standards, tell businesses, look, just like in Kenya where they passed the Bribery Act, and the Bribery Act requires that by default, companies should have certain compliance measures or adequate measures to prevent corruption in place. Put those in place. So that's one. The other thing I think businesses can and should do now is when they set these standards, they should extend it to their network. And so a company can have good compliance systems in place, but it may have third parties. It may have subsidiaries, the headquarters in Abuja, but it may have subsidiaries in Enugu or in, Bauchi or somewhere else. And the standards they have in Abuja don't apply there. So cascading those standards down to all of their subsidiaries, and there are ways to do that. I'll leave you with the very last and very important points that I think companies should think about when they're setting these standards. And this also would apply to law enforcement agencies. Corruption is not a crime you can legislate away. It's not a crime that you can use strictly law enforcement measures to deal with. No. It has a social dimension to it. And to get rid of corruption, you have to do two things: apply incentives and consequences. If the cost of corruption is high and the cost of compliance is low, you will eradicate corruption. But today, what you have in this country is the cost of compliance is high. It's more expensive for businesses to do the right thing, which means to get a license, they have to go several times to NAFDAC or to whatever agency. It's not efficient. The cost of complying with the law, paying your NEPA bill or your FIRS bill, can take more time than to just pay somebody outdoor and he will help you fix it. The cost of complying is too high, but the cost of corruption for most businesses is low, because if they pay those unofficial fees, they are not likely to get caught. They are not likely for their friends to tell them, "We don't want to do business with you if that's how you do business." No, their friends will tell them, "You're not wise now, just pay somebody at the gate and he'll fix it. Why are you wasting time?" So the cost of corruption is too low and the cost of compliance is too high. If we can switch that, we will eradicate corruption in Nigeria.
To curb corruption in the nation, it is important to involve the private sector in the fight against it. At the recent Second National Summit on Diminishing Corruption in the Public Sector, which was part of activities to mark ICPC's 20th anniversary and Nigeria's Diamond Jubilee, seasoned speakers examined how different sectors can work together against corruption. Co-founder and CEO, Convention on Business Integrity, Mr. Soji Apampa, who spoke at the summit on the topic "Together with the Private Sector Against Corruption," talks to us on how the private sector has a role to play in the fight against corruption.
When we say private sector, we should also look beyond the big companies. So I don't want any of your viewers to think big listed companies. All the small MSMEs, all the informal companies as well, they're also part of the private sector, and they make up 96% of the private sector. So they are the ones that we really need to look at. What is their challenge? Their biggest challenge for corruption is at the interface with the regulator, where you have a regulatory agency say, "Hey, come, show me your registration." This is where the exchange happens. Policeman stops them, exchange happens. They apply for a NAFDAC number, the same thing. They want to pay tax. Everything they do every day with any regulator puts them under pressure to get involved with corruption. So what can they do? I think there are a number of things. Number one, they have to refuse it. But you cannot refuse it on your own. So you need some kind of collective action. There needs to be a place that they all come together and have a voice. And that voice should speak for them. So we have a platform, for instance, where we call MSME standards, collecting them together. But I think many more of such collections should happen, because without collective action, you will not have the boldness to actually refuse it. That's the second thing. The first thing. The second thing is to actually report it. Because if you don't report it, yes, you escape today. Tomorrow, they're waiting for you around the corner. You will be back there again. So you have to report it. The next thing is you have to seek redress. It's not enough to report. You have to say, what happened? As a result of your report, this was what I was supposed to get. I didn't get it. Can you ensure that I now get it? You must get that redress. Then you must seek reform. What made it possible for that person to try to hold me over a barrel for me to pay a bribe? You want to make sure they remove it and that cannot happen again. So reform is important. Then once you have reformed it, automate it. So not only can it not happen that way again, now you are sure that in fact you have removed the persons from it and it should happen automatically. Then you want transparency on top of it, that you can see end to end. From when I pay, the money went to this desk, the approval has come through, everything. So we don't just want automation, they want to see transparent automation. But most importantly is to actually have accountability, which is that those who then flout any of those provisions, what happens to them? You want to hold them responsible for their own behavior. I think that if the private sector just does that in their own interest, in their own business interest, it will be very difficult for those who want to continue to perpetrate corruption. Okay, I won't quite call it a formula, but it is the kind of things that I'm alluding to that the private sector can do. And I'm borrowing from the activities of the maritime sector. In the maritime sector in Nigeria, the first thing they did was to do a risk assessment. Where is this corruption even coming from? What makes it so easy to perpetrate? Once ICPC, all of the agencies at the ports, UNDP, TUGA, everybody came together and they did that exercise. Then they did an integrity plan. How do we overcome this to make sure it does not occur again? And they identified things like training of the officials. Also, they identified the need for standard operating procedures. How should it take place? Good. So now all of the agencies identified their standard operating procedures. But then the next thing is, what happens if they don't follow it? That was the next step. They all then agreed on a grievance resolution mechanism. If it is not happening that way, this is what you can do. Now, having had the grievance resolution mechanism, what they're now going to is now to have compliance officers in each of the agencies, so that you can start to, internally, hold people accountable that, no, this is not what we signed up for. This is what the standard operating procedure said. What are the challenges you're having that are making you to break these things? Let's improve the process. And then to have a level of transparency where they're now publishing, here are the infractions we found. Here are the transactions that have gone through without infractions. So people start to get a sense of whether it's improving or it is worsening. For instance, this year, we measured of the vessels visiting Nigeria who cared to let us know before they came in. Of the first 19 that came in before the lockdown, all the way into the lockdown, we found out that more than half came and went without incident. That is a big improvement on previous years. And of those who had incidents, that through this process I'm talking about, they were able to quickly escalate their challenge, it was now resolved on average 1 hour. Things that used to take 48 hours, 72 hours, and with every day the vessel is paying. So when the private sector is beginning to see that if I speak up, it will help me, now that change in behavior is setting in. Now when you board the vessels, you will see a big poster. I'm a member of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. They're already warning the officials that nothing, doesn't matter how long you pressure me, I'm not going to pay.
ICPC, as an anti-corruption agency, has the mandate to deal with all forms of corruption in both the public and private sector, and has actually handled a lot of cases of corrupt practices in the private sector. A lawyer tells us more.
I think to answer that question, we must first find out what powers ICPC has. And the ICPC is created by the Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Act 2000, Section 3, Sub 1. Now, the general mandate of the Commission, that gives it power to do whatever, whether in the public sector or in the private sector, is in Section 6. And Section 6 says, where this Commission suspects any incidences of corruption under the Act or in any other law, it has powers to investigate. So it's immaterial whether those incidences of corrupt practices are, within the public space or in the private sector. Now, going back to your question, I would then say that yes, ICPC has powers to handle issues and incidences of corruption in the private sector, because the private sector does not exist in isolation. It's intertwined. You have contractors working for government, banks, professional bodies. These are all in the private sector. So ICPC has that power. Well, if you look at the Act, the Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Act, you will find that the opening sentences of the sections criminalizing infractions of the Act would either start with any person. So where do you have such sections saying any person who does XYZ, is guilty of an offense? It's talking about people in the private sector, people in the public sector. As long as you come within that regime of a human, you come. So you have in our Act Section 8, Section 9, Section 10. All these sections deal with any person who receives or offers bribe to public officers, to anybody, in relation to the affairs and conduct of public offices, is guilty. Then you have Section 13. Section 13 specifically says if you receive any person, so if you are in the private sector, if you receive anything that was obtained by means of a felony, that means you receive a stolen car, you receive anything that was obtained by means of an illicit act. Okay. So 13, we have Section 18, 17, Section 21, Section 22. These sections, in addition to a whole lot of other sections, deal or covers incidences of corrupt practices in the private sector. Well, you see, all the policies of government are driven majorly by, when there are policies, it will guide both the public space and players in the private sector. The private sector can help, by collaborating with the commission. And this collaboration will come in form of the commission, initiatives from the commission, with the commission, and then the buy-in of the private sector into the activities of the commission through the things like public enlightenment. If you organize public enlightenment gathering and people don't come around, of course, it goes to no issue. So they can help in curbing corruption in our system by, committing to platforms provided by the commission, attending to, forums where public enlightenment campaigns are carried out. And I think also that when we talk about the private sector and having them to buy in, it's important that, such most professional bodies, like ICANN, because you find where previously asked me about if I've handled such cases. Now, we have done a lot of cases where people falsified tax returns. Yeah. And of course, they will go get, either there is an accountant somewhere who has done that. So we need the buy-in of, professional bodies like ICANN, Nigerian Bar Association, Nigerian Medical Association, quantity surveyors. We have cases of collapsed bridges, buildings here and there. So we need those people to come in. And again, where you don't solve, because those are preventive measures, yes, as it were. But where that is not working, and the commission has to escalate its mandate by prosecuting. When you prosecute and convict and people are shown the prison walls, that will also act as a deterrent.
Corruption can mess up every good thing a nation has. A nation is blessed with every good thing all around. If you and I care, we gonna get there. Just ask me how. It starts from you and I. Make you say no. When they give you bribe or ask you for bribe, make you say no. If you're there for office and tempted to steal, make you say no.
private sector is crucial to the reduction of corruption as it features prominently in the occurrence of corruption in the public sector. Therefore, its active engagement to help in the fight against these leads can never be overemphasized. The Commission has provided different platforms in which acts of corruption, whether in the public or private sector, can be reported. You can also visit our website www.icpc.gov.ng or call any of our toll-free numbers as shown on the screen. That's our package on this week's edition. You can also watch the program on our YouTube channel www.youtube.com/ICPC Nigeria. See you again next week. Bye for now.